The first two mishnayot that we saw engaged in the question of determining accidentalness based on a person's behavior. When examining the activity, does it qualify as accidental? Now the question moves to, and who is this person? Is there something about this person that might serve as a categorical exemption from galut? Are there some people who simply do not go into galut because what is usually considered accidental would never apply to them? The first case the Mishnah considers is the case of a blind person, the someh. A blind person does not have the same ability to check for their surroundings, to literally look out for other people. So they might be unable to meet the minimal standard of culpability required to go into galut. The other, equally interesting case is one that is explicitly referred to in the psukim, but treated much differently here. When the verses in Bimidbar want to clarify which case is considered accidental, they contrast it with someone who acts with sin'ah or eva, with hatred or enmity. An accidental death occurs without seeing and by someone who does not seek the harm of the victim. This opens up the very important question. If someone is in fact the enemy of the victim, does that motive on its own render all other details moot? Can the death still be ruled accidental if its agent had it in for the victim? Ve'im b'sin'ah yehadafenu, right? If he is to push him with hatred, o be'eva hikahu, or with enmity strike him, rotzeachu, then he's considered to be a killer. Goel hadam yamit et harotzeach. Then the Goel hadam actually does kill this person who committed the murder, and they are not afforded the protection or the atonement of the Ir Miklat. Hasomeh eino goleh. The Mishnah begins by saying that a blind person does not go into galut. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir Omer, but Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, says, goleh, no, a somet does, in fact, a blind person may go into galut. We'll explore this more in our Gemara. And in the parallel conversation of a blind person's agency and liability that you saw in the parallel source in Bava Kama, but for now, we'll suffice with our translation. Continuing from the someh to the soneh, hasoneh eino goleh, someone who is an enemy, does not go into galut. Rabbi Yossi Omer, hasoneh neharag, the person who we know to be an enemy is put to death, mipnei shehu kimu'ad, because that person is considered to be like a mu'ad. The word mu'ad literally means testified against, and it comes from the case of two oxen, one of whom is considered to be tam, innocent. This is an ox without a record. And an ox that is mu'ad, this is an ox that has a record and has been testified about before. If I already have an ox that is mu'ad, and that ox then causes damage, I can't say, oh my goodness, I'm so surprised, my ox? I would never have imagined. Okay, so there's a much higher standard of liability. When you have a known quantity, I know that that ox is a troublemaker, and look, he made trouble. So Rabbi Yossi says it's the same thing with an enemy. I need to look at everything that happens through the lens of the fact that this person is an enemy. They are considered to be known. They are mu'ad. They are known to be dangerous. There is agreement that the person who is an enemy, the soneh, can't get the protection or expiation of galut. But Rabbi Yossi goes even further and says that this enmity defines the action. There is no such thing as an accidental killing by a person who is an enemy. He compares this to the case of the mu'ad. If an animal which is not known to be a threat causes harm, and they are considered to be innocent, any damage caused by them is considered accidental. But if an animal is mu'ad, its owners have a higher level of responsibility. If this animal has exhibited a pattern of dangerous behavior and they strike again, it's not oops, it is criminal negligence. Analogously, it seems that what Rabbi Yossi is saying is that we are both the dangerous animal and its owner. A human being is both someone who is known to have certain tendencies and is also the person who must be in control of those tendencies. If I know that I hate someone, I need to guard myself more. I need to understand that my subconscious desires can influence my actions. And even if it seems like what I have done is accidental, it was my responsibility to keep myself away, since I categorically can no longer be trusted. And perhaps Rabbi Yossi is also pointing out that hating someone, declaring them your enemy, is not a morally neutral stance. It is itself a small act of violence, which can turn into a larger act of violence if you aren't scrupulously careful. The declaring yourself as an enemy itself is the first strike, and then anything that happens afterwards are strikes 2 and 3. Rabbi Shimon Omer, yesh sonei goleh, v'yesh sonei she'eno goleh. Rabbi Shimon says, no, actually, sometimes an enemy can go into galut, and sometimes an enemy does not go into galut. Zeh haklal, this is the principle. Kol shehu yachol lomar lada'at harag, any situation where one could say he killed with knowledge, eino goleh, that person is too liable, they cannot go into galut. V'shelo lada'at harag, but if they didn't have any awareness when they killed, that person is still considered to be a rotzeach bishgaga, accidentally. Harei zeh goleh, this person does go into galut. Rabbi Shimon, in contrast to Rabbi Yossi, thinks that the verses supply the details about an enemy because an enemy is the most likely scenario in which one person chooses to kill another. Being an enemy is not in and of itself determinant of what has happened or will happen. Rabbi Shimon thinks that accidents happen, even among people who have bad blood between them. The Gemara then continues to probe the textual underpinnings of the conversation about the someh in our Mishnah by then bringing up Breita. There is some fancy footwork going on in this Breita, and even fancier footwork going on in the Gemara following, and we will go through it closely. In the verse's description of the incident with the casting of the stone, it says, O bechol even asher yamut ba, or with any stone which could possibly cause death, below ra'ot, without seeing. This detail, below ra'ot, is the locus for the conversation between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir in the Breita we are about to read. What does without seeing mean? Is it literal? And how does that language relate to someone who never sees? In the Breita, it seems that both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are reading the phrase below ra'ot literally. Rabbi Meir says this comes to include the blind person. This is a case where the person happened not to see, so it obviously applies to a case where a person never sees. Another way of putting it, there is no one more capable of this kind of accident than a blind person, because a blind person does not see. And the paradigmatic way of this incident happening is without seeing. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, also reads without seeing in its literal sense, that it is about vision. But for him, this doesn't include the case of the blind person, it excludes them. Because it only makes sense to describe a person as happening not to see if they are generally able to see. Since the blind person never sees, they didn't fail to see in this instance. Therefore, they are not covered by this case of accidental murder. Let's look at the Gemara's analysis of this Breita. Tanu Rabbanan, below ra'ot, without seeing, prat l'someh. This excludes the blind person, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That is what Rabbi Yehuda says. Rabbi Meir Omer, but Rabbi Meir says, below ra'ot, not without seeing, comes lirabot et hasomeh. It comes to include the blind person. And now the Gemara is going to probe this machloket. My ta'ama de Rabbi Yehuda. What is Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning? Dichtiv, as it says in the pasuk that we just saw, va'asher yavo et re'ehu bayahar. Somebody joins his friend in the forest. That scenario could be anyone. Afilu someh. That even includes a blind person. Ata below ra'ot. So the phrase without seeing comes me'ate and excludes the blind person. When I first set up the scene, it seemed like it would also include a blind person who is perfectly ambulatory and could find themselves in the forest. But then when it says who happens not to see, that clarifies that the blind person actually is not included. Since, as we said in our analysis of the Mishnah, they never see. If I say that this case is unique because the perpetrator couldn't see, it can't be talking about someone for whom not seeing is always how they go through life. In the Gemara's analysis of Rabbi Yehuda, the language of below ra'ot is connected to the language of whoever comes into the forest. Whoever comes into the forest includes everyone. Without seeing excludes this particular person who doesn't see. And then we come back. The Rabbi Meir, below ra'ot lima'et. When Rabbi Meir has the phrase without seeing, that comes to exclude. Bivli da'at, without knowing, that also comes to exclude. Wait a minute. That constructs havei, that is mi'ut achar mi'ut, an exclusion followed by a second exclusion. And now we're going to use a standard principle of rabbinic exegesis. Ve'ein mi'ut achar mi'ut, and you never have a restriction, an exclusion, followed by a second exclusion without actually including something, ela lirabot. I'm going to read that one more time. Ve'ein mi'ut achar mi'ut, and there is no exclusion that follows another exclusion, which doesn't end up including something else. We will explain. In the Gemara's analysis of Rabbi Meir, we already had an exclusion, below ra'ot, followed by a second exclusion, bivli da'at, without awareness. The technical language for this exclusion following exclusion, mi'ut achar mi'ut. One narrowing of scope, followed by a second narrowing of scope, and then the rule is that this translates into an expansion of scope. I'll explain this logic to you. If I say, you may not have the fruit, no bananas, I am actually saying to you, what I meant by saying you may not have the fruit is that you may not have these bananas. So the second restriction, no bananas, ends up enabling you to eat any other fruit. Again, if I had just said, you may not have the fruit, you would not be permitted to eat any fruit. Once I clarify by specifying that what I meant by the fruit is bananas, then it actually turns out that my second restriction, no bananas, ends up being an expansion because it clarifies that my original prohibition applied only to bananas, and that means that any other fruit is now fine. So let's plug this back into the verses. If I had said below ra'ot without seeing, you would have thought that meant any case where a person doesn't see, including a blind person. When I clarify that what I meant by not seeing is not having any awareness, that means that I didn't mean not seeing in a literal sense. And therefore, a blind person who has awareness, though they cannot physically see, is now included by the case. And a blind person is now clearly eligible for Galut. What I also want you to notice is that a shift has been made in the understanding of what below ra'ot means. In the Braita, below ra'ot meant physically not seeing, according to all opinions. In the Gemara's analysis of the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda still understands below ra'ot as being about physical sight, but Rabbi Meir understands it as being about awareness. And you might have noticed that in your Revised Standard Version of the translation of the Pasuk, they translate below ra'ot as without awareness. This is important because when Rabbi Meir says explicitly, I think that blind people are just as aware. They have just as much da'at as people who are sighted. That implies that maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda does not think of blind people as having the same level of awareness as people who are sighted. And we see this in the parallel in Bava Kama that you had on your source sheet. Rabbi Yehuda also thinks that a blind person is not eligible for payment if they are shamed, boshet. And perhaps this is an outgrowth of his thinking of them as people who are less aware of their surroundings, less aware of other people, and perhaps simply less self-aware. Shame, boshet, is a category that is only relevant to people who have a heightened awareness of themselves and where they are in relationship to society. And Rabbi Yehuda does not think of blind people as having that capacity, and therefore, if someone shames them, they haven't really done anything, and they do not have to pay. We'll close out the Gemara with Rabbi Yehuda's technical rejoinder. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda read the phrase bivli dat, without awareness, as prat lemitkaven. As we saw earlier, this comes to exclude the case of where you have some level of intention. Hu da'ata, it comes. We're going to read that phrase together. Rabbi Yehuda, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, bivli da'at prat lemitkaven hu da'ata. The phrase bivli da'at, without awareness, it is coming to exclude the case of the mitkaven. Without awareness does not come as a follow-up to clarify the meaning of below ra'ot. It is not a mi'ut achar mi'ut, rather it is its own separate exclusion. It comes to exclude someone who actually is aware, the mitkaven. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the analog here is not, you may not eat the fruit, followed by no bananas. It is much more akin to, you may not eat the fruit, go clean your room. They are two exclusions, two prohibitions, certainly, but ones that do not inform each other in any way. They're not related, and therefore, they are not considered to be a mi'ut achar mi'ut. I want to point out two subtleties that characterize our Gemara. The first is, as we have mentioned, the Gemara continues to conflate the different accounts in Shemot, Bemidbar, and Dvarim. This sugya is an extreme example of this phenomenon. If you read this Gemara and were not looking up the verses on your own, you would think that the details about the forest, below ra'ot, and the phrase bivli dat were from the same verse, or at the very least from the same parasha. But in fact, below ra'ot is from Bemidbar, and bivli dat and the forest scene are from Dvarim. The second phenomenon is Bavli-wide, and that is the need to account for all of the phrases in a verse and make sure that you are deriving something meaningful from each. After Rabbi Meir has learned something specific from the phrase bivli dat that compels Rabbi Yehuda, well, the Gemara is speaking for Rabbi Yehuda, to find a different law or lesson derived from that phrase. In rabbinic literature outside of the Bavli, it is perfectly legitimate to have a phrase in a pasuk which only one person treats as significant. So in another work, you could have Rabbi Meir make a lot of hay out of bivli da'at, and Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't need to respond. But in the Bavli, once a phrase has been identified as significant, what I like to call an exegetical opportunity, it compels all parties to account for its presence and learn something from it. So Rabbi Yehuda needs to find something else that he is learning from bivli da'at, or else Rabbi Meir would win in the competition because he has an extra phrase from the pasuk that supports him that Rabbi Yehuda does not account for. The conversation between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is not only about the nature of the someh, the nature of this one person who we might consider to be categorically excluded, but it's also about how to read the pasuk, right? Do I want to read the pasuk in its most literal sense? And then I need to figure out, how does someone who doesn't fit perfectly into the literal meaning fit into the framework? Or am I thinking about what the pasuk really means? Is when I'm talking about things being accidental, when I'm talking about intent, that is a more abstract concept that needs to be dealt with more delicately and thought about on a different level beyond what are the actual words that are written in the verse. In the next session, we're going to be continuing our analysis of the case of the soneh and see the way that does or does not impact guilt in these cases.